Welcome to the Smithsonian's first connected classroom, Wing, a conversation about flight. My name is Ashley Naranjo, and I'm an educator here at the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. We work with over 19 museums, 9 research centers, and the National Zoo. Joining me today is Dr. John Anderson, the curator for aerodynamics at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Welcome, John. Also joining us today are 2 very special classrooms. First, Ms. McLean's 4th graders at Clance Hill Middle School in Glendale, Wisconsin. Can you give us a hello? Wonderful. And also Mrs. Begg's Technology Lab over at Churchville Middle School in Elmhurst, Illinois. Welcome. If those of you who are watching have questions of your own, please feel free to write in the text box in the Q&A app for the Google Hangout. Finally, we're also joined by a special guest, Michael Hulslander, who's an educator at the National Air and Space Museum and streaming to us live from the Wright Flyer Gallery. Michael?
Good afternoon, everyone. As Ashley said, I'm standing here at the Wright Brothers Gallery in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about wings. Wings come in many shapes and sizes, and there are several different ways you can describe wing shapes. But today we're going to be focusing on aspect ratio and what we call airfoil shapes. So first let's talk a little bit about aspect ratio. What is aspect ratio? Well, simply stated, aspect ratio is the ratio of the length of a wing by its width, or the depth of the wing. And generally, long or high aspect ratios are characterized by long, narrow wings. And low aspect ratios are characterized by short, fat, or deep wings. The other thing we're going to be talking about is airfoil shapes. Oh, one quick thing. I want to show you airfoil, or I mean the aspect ratio real quick. So you can see I'm wearing wings. Let me step back real quick. Just so you get an idea, when I say the length of the wing, I'm talking from one wingtip to the other. That's the length of the wing. And when I talk about the depth of the wing, I'm talking about what they call chord length, and that's from the leading edge, the very tip of the leading edge, to the very end of the trailing edge. So a straight line drawn from the leading edge to the trailing edge would be the chord length. All right, back to airfoil shapes. So airfoil shapes dictate how the wing generates lift quite often. And when we say airfoil, basically what we're saying is, what we're talking about is a cross-section of the wing. Now I have a little prop here. This is my loaf of bread. Can everyone see that? So if you imagine the wing is a loaf of bread, and then if we cut a section from that bread, a cross-section from that bread, we now have a piece of bread. That would be the airfoil shape of the airplane's wing. And this shape would help dictate the amount of lift that the airplane or the wing generates. Now, to hear more about wings, aspect ratios, and airfoil shapes, let's turn it back to Dr. Anderson.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much. I'd like everybody to realize, by the way, that what we were talking about, wings and airfoils, when you fly on an airplane and you are held up in the air, it is aerodynamic lift that holds you up in the air, and most of that lift is coming from the wing. So the wing of an airplane is an essential, very important component of airplane flight. And that's why we pay so much attention to the proper design of wings. So I want to lead you through a couple of thoughts extending what Mike was telling you about airfoils and wings. And we're going to start by looking at a glider, an early glider of the Wright brothers. Get one on the screen.
Sure. So let's take a look at the 1900 Wright glider.
There we are. This was a glider that the Wright brothers designed in 1900 to start testing their ideas on wings and flying machines. And I want you to concentrate. Look at that airfoil shape. Look how thin it is. It's extremely thin. It looks like a bird's wing. And if you would look at the top view, you would see that the aspect ratio that has been defined for you is not very large. The wings are not very long. In contrast, this is the Wright brothers 1902 glider. Look, that is aesthetically much prettier. And the reason it is because the Wrights discovered in their wind tunnel test, that to make the glider fly more aerodynamically efficient, more lift and less drag, you want a high aspect ratio. Look at those wings. Still a very thin airfoil, but a much higher aspect ratio wing, and that allowed them to fly better with their gliders, and it made the 1903 Wright Flyer, the actual airplane itself, much more successful. And there you are. You're looking at the original, the real thing in the Wright Brothers Gallery at the National Air and Space Museum. And what you see there is a flying machine with a very thin airfoil and a wing with a very high aspect ratio. Now, while we're looking at this, by the way, let me mention the reason why the aspect ratio is so important and why a high aspect ratio works better is that if you go out to the very tips of the wings for an airplane in flight, there are some mean vortices that are coming off the tips of the wing. They're like little mini tornadoes that trail downstream from the tips of the wings. And you want to get those mini tornadoes, those vortices, as far away from the rest of the airplane as possible. And in fact, here's a picture of the Wright Flyer in flight. And with this high aspect ratio, these nasty wingtip vortices, which cause an increase in drag and a decrease in lift, are further away, and that's why that high aspect ratio works better. That's why one of the primary reasons why the Wright Flyer got off the ground. This is a historic photograph, by the way. This is the photograph taken at the instant in December 17th, 1903, when the Wright Flyer first lifted off the ground as Orville Wright, prone on the bottom wing, and that's Wilbur Wright running along the right-hand side to keep the wingtip from dragging in the sand. The first successful flight of a heavier-than-air, controlled, powered, piloted flying machine in history. And it had a high aspect ratio wing with a very thin airfoil.
Wow, we actually have a student question. Did the Wright brothers sell planes in other states or countries?
Oh, the answer is eventually yes, not in 1903. It took a number of years before the Wright's success was actually became well known within the public. It wasn't until 1908 that Wilbur demonstrated the airplane successfully in France, and suddenly everybody realized that the Wrights had invented the first successful airplane, and they began to sell under license airplanes in Europe. They also constructed a factory in their hometown of Dayton, Ohio, the Wright Aeronautical Company, and they sold airplanes here in the United States. Not a whole lot, not very many, but they did sell them.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Dr. Anderson.
We're looking at an edge view of, in this case, the Wright glider. And you just emphasizing this very thin airfoil. I'm going to have more to say about a thin airfoil. Question, is this thin airfoil really the way to go? Is this a good shape for an airfoil? Well, let's hold on and we'll see. I'd like to take you to the next generation of airplanes. We're going to go to World War I. And there you're looking at a very famous airplane, the SPAD-13. Now, this is the SPAD-13. This is basically a souped-up Wright Flyer, same two wings biplane configuration. We have struts in between the wings to stabilize the wings. But boy, does it have a powerful engine. which made the SPAD 13 fly at about 120 miles an hour. But once again, hey, we're talking about wings, airfoils, wing shapes, and if you look carefully at here's another picture of the SPAD 13, it's got thin wings, thin airfoils, I should say, thin airfoils. And ultimately, that thin airfoil, we'll leave this picture on for a minute, that thin airfoil is a problem because when the airplane is pitched up by the pilot to a higher incidence angle to the airflow, a higher angle of attack to try to get more lift, there's a tendency for the airflow over the top of that wing to separate, pop right off of the surface. And suddenly the wing stalls and the lift goes downhill and the airplane goes downhill and all bad things. So these thin airfoils turned out for real airplanes under real conditions to be not too good. And that caused problems when the airplanes were pitched to just moderate angles of attack, particularly during dogfights, maneuvering in the air. This was not a good shape. But people didn't know it at the time because wind tunnel tests at that time showed thin airfoils to have lower drag than thicker airfoils. So everybody went with these thin airfoils until the end of World War I. When we go to another picture here, we're going to go to and I'll wait for that to come up. There we are. What you're looking at there is a Fokker D7. This is a German airplane designed at the end of World War I, about 1917, 1918. If you look carefully at the airfoil shape here, you see a thick airfoil, not a thin airfoil, because in between the beginning of World War I and the end of World War I, and particularly in Germany, more wind tunnel tests showed that a thick airfoil, actually, there's another picture of the D7, a thick airfoil actually behaved better. The pilot could go to much higher angles of attack before the wing stalled, before the flow would pop off the top surface. And this allowed this airplane to maneuver much more readily, to climb faster. It was a very effective and dangerous airplane, so to speak, to the Allies during World War I. A thick airfoil. With that, if you and when you visit the World War I gallery at the Air and Space Museum, you'll come in, you'll see that SPAD 13 with its thin airfoil. You'll walk through the gallery and you'll see this Fokker D7 at the end of the gallery, at the exit. And what you will be seeing there is a revolution in airfoil design, going from thin airfoils, like on the Wright Flyer, like on the SPAD, to thick airfoils here on the Fokker D7. It was a revolution in airfoil design.
Wonderful, thanks so much. And now we're actually going to go back to our friend Michael, who is right in front of the Douglas DC-3, a different location over at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Michael?
Standing in front of the DC-3, which was first put into production and released in 1935. So it's a fairly old aircraft, but it's a beautiful aircraft. It is one of the most successful airliners ever put into production, with more than 16,000 aircraft being released. And there are still some DC-3s flying today. So it's been a very successful aircraft. Now, Dr. Anderson, as I look at this aircraft, I notice that the wings look a whole lot different than the wings of the three aircraft we've been talking about previously. Why is that?
Well, Mike, if we look at the DC-3, it also has now a very nice, thick, but rather streamlined airfoil. You can see that in this picture. And if we were underneath, standing underneath or standing on top of the DC-3, and we would look at the whole wing shape, we would see, there it is, we would see a wing with an aspect ratio, a very large aspect ratio of 9.5. That's really high. for a wing design aspect ratio, and that high aspect ratio, remember, is getting those nasty vortices further away from the rest of the airplane. That high aspect ratio is one of the reasons for the aerodynamic success and therefore the economic success of the DC-3. One of the most famous and one of the most important airplanes to have ever been designed in the history of the airplane, and we're proud to have one hanging in the Air Transportation Gallery at the Air and Space Museum. And there's sort of a tip end picture of the very tip end of the DC-3. You can see the streamlined, thick airfoil on that airplane. So if we go to the next one, we're going to move on to something rather dramatically different. What you're looking at is yet another airplane hanging in the National Air and Space Museum. This is the Lockheed F-104. It is the first airplane to be designed for sustained flight at twice the speed of sound. We call it Mach 2. This is a supersonic airplane. It is so totally different than anything we've looked at so far in our discussion here. And I want you again to concentrate on the wing and the airfoil shape. The airfoil shape, you can see it there. It is super thin. It is super thin, and the aspect ratio is small now, very small. Very thin airfoils and very low aspect ratios are examples of supersonic airplane design. And the reason it looks like we're returning back to the very beginnings, but not really, because when you fly at supersonic speeds, one tremendous big physical thing happens, and that is the creation of shock waves. Shock waves on the airplane, shock waves the nose, shock waves at the leading edges of the wings. And these shock waves cause horrendous increases in drag. It's called supersonic wave drag. So when you design a supersonic airplane, you want to make certain that you do everything to reduce the strength of these shock waves and reduce this wave drag. And how do you reduce the strength of the shock wave? Right there, an exceptionally thin airfoil with a super sharp leading edge. My goodness, the leading edge is so sharp that when that airplane is on the ground, a protective glove is placed over the leading edge to protect the leading edge from the ground personnel and ground personnel from the leading edge. It's razor sharp in order to diminish and weaken the strengths of the shock waves. So once again, the wing, in this case, the wing and the airfoil shape, it is designed to try to optimize the aerodynamics for the flight regime that the airplane is supposed to fly in. In this case, Mach 2. This airplane does not fly well at low speeds. It would not do well as a Wright flyer. It's in a totally different flight regime. But this is why aeronautical engineers have to pay attention to such things. And once again, it's the wing, the airfoil shape, the aspect ratio. The wing is the heart of the airplane. The airfoil is the heart of the wing. And so this is why we, as aerospace engineers, pay very close attention to the design of the airfoil and the design of the wing.
Wonderful. I think that leads us into a great question we had from a student. If they were going to build an airplane just like the first airplane, what objects would they have to gather to build one themselves? And keep in mind, this was over 100 years ago that the Wright brothers were doing this, right?
Oh, wow. But first of all, you have to gather together some intellectual information on how you want to design the shape of your airplane. And then you've got to gather materials, lightweight materials, because, look, the airplane is flying through the air, is sustained in the air by the aerodynamic lift of the wings. And what is being sustained? Well, it's the weight, the actual weight of the airplane. It's the weight of the structure of the airplane, and it's the weight of the things in the airplane, you and baggage and other materials, other packages. And you want to collect lightweight material. The Wright brothers knew this. They made the Wright Flyer. Would you believe this? The Wright Flyer was made by means of a wood structure out of the wood spruce. The wood structure was actually made out of spruce, and what you see is the covering on the wings. That was French sateen cotton covering that was just sort of sewn together by Catherine Wright, the Wright brothers' sister, and it was stretched over that spruce wing structure, very loosely attached to it. The engine was was made out of aluminum, lightweight metal, and the Wrights were pretty. Especially Orville Wright was a fairly thin guy. I think he weighed about 140 pounds. They were very careful about weight. So when you want to design something to fly, you first have to learn kind of aerodynamically what shape you want to make it, but then you make it out of very lightweight materials. But hey, they have to be strong enough, lightweight but strong, because you don't want your wings to fold up on you while you're flying. That would be a disaster. So it's got to be lightweight but strong. That's materials. You look for the right materials and you look for the right shape.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I know we have some student questions from our connected classrooms. So I'm going to open the floor to Glens Hill Middle School over in Glendale, Wisconsin. Do you guys have any questions for us?
Okay, who wants to ask a question? Andreas, did you have a question? Oh, we're going to freeze here. Hold on one second. Did anyone have a question to ask about?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I forgot what it was though.
Oh. Can you come back to us?
Sure, no problem. We'll give you a second to think about this. This is also a good time to mention that if we don't get to your questions today, if you've been typing in the chat, there's also a really great place on the How Things Fly website from the National Air and Space Museum where you can ask an explainer. So if we don't get to your question, or maybe it's related to another topic about flight, there are explainers that work at the National Air and Space Museum who are high school and college students who are able to answer all of your questions. They're specially trained and they work in our exhibits, so that's a great place to also ask questions. Let's go to Churchill Middle School over in Elmhurst, Illinois. Does anyone in your classroom have a question for us?
Okay, come on, Jalen. Say you're just, I'm Jalen.
Okay, hi. Okay, I'm Jalen, and my question is, how do aerodynamics help keep paper airplanes in the air?
Oh, I'll pose an answer, and then I think Mike can also give you an answer because he makes lots of paper airplanes. But the same way that a real airplane is held in the air, when a paper airplane flies through the air, it's creating aerodynamic lift because the paper weighs something, it has weight. And so you want the lift at least to try to balance the weight. And it's producing lift just the way a real airplane does, there's an airflow over the wings, and in that airflow, the air pressure over the top of the wing is slightly less than the air pressure over the bottom of the wing. And just think about that. You have less pressure on the top, higher pressure on the bottom, and what's going to happen? Presto, it's going to lift up. And that's the same thing happens with a paper airplane. However, a paper airplane probably only weighs a couple of ounces, and when you're flying across the ocean in a Boeing 747 that weighs close to 1 million pounds, and then those wings have to produce 1 million pounds of lift. But it's still essentially the same physics. The physics is the same.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Churchville Middle School.
And I would just comment that the four forces of flight that are acting on aircraft that you fly in are also acting on the paper airplane that you build and throw. Obviously, however, the paper airplane doesn't generate a sustainable amount of thrust. The thrust is generated by you, the thrower. So it's a limited amount of thrust. And once the thrust runs out, the drag slows the aircraft down, and it goes into the ground.
Should we
Wonderful.
what experiments?
And Glens Hill Middle School, did you have a question for us?
We do. Come on up, John.
Raising my hand for 5 hours.
Okay. There. I don't know if you're on, but you can go ahead and ask your question.
What do you think is the best metal to make a plane out of?
Oh, that's easy, because when you look at virtually all airplanes that are flying today, they're all made out of aluminum. And the reason that they're made out of aluminum is that aluminum is a very lightweight but strong metal. There are steel, inside the airplane there are also members, various parts of the airplane that are made out of steel, but the main skin structure, the main structural element, metal element in an airplane today is a metal airplane is aluminum.
And we might want to point out too, Dr. Anderson, that aircraft manufacturers like Boeing are starting to use a lot more composite material that's made by humans, and a combination of different materials, because it's even lighter weight than aluminum and stronger.
Right, Mike, you're exactly right. And maybe, hopefully, you and I live another 20 years, we'll be flying around on these composite airplanes.
Wonderful. Let's check back with Churchville Middle School. Do you have another question for us?
Sure. Say your name.
I'm Sam, and I was wondering, would something that is aerodynamic also move the same way in water?
That's a very good question. If you generally, aerodynamics means you're looking at the flow of air over objects. However, an object in water is very similar. That's called hydrodynamics. But the same, nature acts the same in our natural world for virtually everything. And water and air, they're both called fluids. And so the aerodynamics of a ship, or the aerodynamics of a submarine, if you want to call it that, be basically following the same laws as the aerodynamics of an airplane flying through the air. The only difference is that water is a whole lot more dense than air is, but the same physical laws dictate the flow of water over an object in the water as dictate the flow of air over an airplane. Very similar. Good. It's a very good question.
Interesting. And we'll go back to our other classroom in Wisconsin. Did you guys have one more question for us?
I think we do, yeah. Oh, we have two more if you get a chance, but here's our first.
That would be great.
Hi, my name's Andreas, and I was wondering, what is the fastest plane known?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Okay, quick answer. If you talk about a plane like an ordinary airplane with a fuselage of wings and a pilot and so forth, that we have the fastest airplane in the Air and Space Museum. It's called the X-15, an experimental airplane, and it flew at 7 times the speed of sound, and it's called Mach 7.
Wow.
And it still holds the record today for the fastest, the highest Mach number for an airplane. Now you can think about the space shuttle, went up in space. Is that an airplane? Not really. That's more of a spaceship. The space shuttle flew through the atmosphere at about 28 times the speed of sound. That's really fast. But is that an airplane? You might think about that. I think it's not really an airplane. So an airplane, the answer to your question, the fastest airplane is still today the X-15 experimental airplane, flew at Mach 7. That's pretty fast.
Wow. And do you have another question for us?
I just want to point out too, we should put a shameless plug. Dr. Anderson just wrote a book on the X-15, so if the kids want to learn more about the X-15, they should check out Dr. Anderson's book.
Thank you, Mike.
I have one more question.
Oh, great.
How did you get the Wright brothers plane?
Oh boy. Okay, I say oh boy because if we had an hour, I could give you the whole story. Here's the short story. When the Wright Flyer flew in 1903, again, it was not really recognized. Most people didn't realize that had happened. It wasn't until 1908, when the Wrights successfully flew in the public eye, that everybody suddenly woke up to the fact that they had the first successful airplane. At about that time, even prior to that, the secretary of the Smithsonian, Samuel P. Langley, had been building flying machines and had tried to fly one actually just weeks before the Wrights flew their 1903 machine. And it wasn't successful. It kind of broke, the wing folded up in midair. However, in about 10 years later, it was called the Langley Aerodrome. The Langley machine was put back together again and flown by Glenn Curtiss up in upstate New York. And most people didn't realize it had 93 modifications to it, but it flew successfully. And so the Langley Aerodrome was brought back to the Smithsonian and put on display with a sign under it saying the Langley Aerodrome, the first airplane capable of successful flight. And the Orville Wright, who Wilbur had died by that time, Orville Wright, as you might expect, was ticked off. And when the Smithsonian asked Orville Wright to pass on the Wright Flyer to the Smithsonian, he said no. And in fact, he said no for many years. The Wright Flyer, the original Wright Flyer, he passed on to the British Science Museum in South Kensington, London. And it was in the British Science Museum from 1928 until through the end of World War II. It survived all the bombs, the Blitz and so forth. And finally, in 1948, when that was the year of Orville Wright's death, it was made known in his papers that he agreed for the Wright Flyer to finally to come into the Smithsonian Institution. And in 1948, about July 4th, I think, that machine was mounted with pride in the Smithsonian, in the what we call the old Arts and Industries building of the Smithsonian. So that's a short story. You should hear the long story. It's a fascinating story, interplay between people and things. But anyway, that's the short answer.
Good question, students. Mike, before we finish up, I know we're trying to just finish up with a half an hour. I know a lot of students are interested in this topic of flight. Do you have any suggestions for what type of activities or experiments they could do?
I sure do, Ashley. I want to give you all sort of a call to action to build your own aircraft, model aircraft. What I have here, there are a couple of ways you can build your own model aircraft. One is just using those styrofoam meat trays. You can use scissors or with the help of a parent, an X-Acto knife, to cut out different shapes, like airplane wings, the fuselage, the horizontal stabilizer, and you can build different gliders with different wings and different aspect ratios. So in fact, these two airplanes with these two very different looking wings have the same wing area. It's about 10 square inches, but you can tell they are very different aspect ratios. So what do you think? Which one should fly better? That's a question for you. Also, I know some of you have built paper airplanes. So I encourage you to try to build different airplanes and pay attention to the shapes of the wings. Look at the aspect ratio of the different wings. The wing shape should affect dramatically the way the paper airplane flies, just as it does with the styrofoam glider. And of course, if you haven't done any of that, or if you haven't been to an airport recently, I encourage you to go out with your class or your parents or your friends go to the airport and look at the airplanes there at the airport, you'll see a variety of different wing shapes and sizes right there in front of you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mike, for joining us from the National Air and Space Museum.
Thanks for having me.
For joining us as well. And just a reminder to students and teachers, this was our first connected classroom, but if you want to learn more about this topic, you can visit learning.si.edu as well as howthingsfly.si.edu, and you can follow us on Google+ and Twitter for more updates about programs like this or upcoming resources, events, and learn more from the Smithsonian. Thanks so much for joining us to both of the classrooms. Could we say a quick goodbye to Churchville Middle School, if you guys could wave to us. It's great to have you with us, as well as Glendale, Wisconsin. Can you guys say a quick goodbye? All right, wonderful. Well, thanks so much for everyone for joining us, and we look forward to having you join us at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much.
Thank you.